For those who don't know me, I'm Betsy. I'm a science and health journalist, and I'm the community manager at CASW Connector, which is hosting this chat today. Kate, do you want to start recording? Okay, so we're going to record this, and everyone will get a copy of the recording after. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders before we get started. Please keep yourself muted. Please post your questions in the chat. We will start with a discussion between the panelists, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience questions at the end. But we'll also keep an eye out, and if anyone has pressing questions or like follow-up or clarification questions during the discussion, feel free to ask those. Also, for folks who don't know this, Zoom has sort of upgraded its chat functions recently, and you can now use emojis, so you can upvote or react or respond to people's questions if you see something that really resonates with you. So feel free to kind of carry out the discussion there. We'll keep it in mind in making sure we get all the most pressing questions answered. We also have closed captioning available, so you can enable that anytime by finding the captions button in the navigation menu and clicking show captions. You can also disable that with hide captions in the same menu. And as I said, we're recording this, and you will get a link to the recording as well as a tip sheet that we're going to post on both a CSW Connector site and the journalist resource. Also, if you aren't getting our newsletters from Connector or the journalist resource, we recommend subscribing to those for more information, more resources like this. Also, for folks who are not familiar with the Connector website, I wanted to give a quick intro just so that you're not like, what is this organization? So CASW stands for the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. It is a nonprofit that supports science writing, including both journalism and other forms of science communication. And Connector is a project specifically intended to help people who are science writers find different kinds of resources that might be useful in their work. So the heart of the project really is this searchable database. You can see we have about 450 entries in it right now. It includes a lot of articles from Journalist Resource and from other kinds of science writing sites, academic programs, and you can use these filters to search for both different topics of resources and different formats. You can look for awards, science writing related awards, organizations, stories, articles, books, tip sheets, guides, training programs, fellowships, grants, all kinds of stuff is available in here. We're adding to it regularly, and our newsletter is a great way to find out about resources we've recently added, or we also try to keep an eye on deadlines that are coming up for things like grants and fellowships and some of the big science writing awards. So that's what we do. Now I will turn it over to Nasim, who is Senior Health Editor at the Journalist Resource and who will be moderating this chat. We're super excited to be partnering with Journalist Resource on this.
Hello, thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction, and so excited to have you guys here. And thank you for our panelists for joining us, making time today. I'm at the Journalist Resource. If you haven't heard about us, we do a lot of explainers and tip sheets to help journalists better understand research, academic research, and use it in their stories. So we have a lot of explainers on our website, for instance, for about what is a p-value and how to use it. And also if you are writing about different topics, we curate research, especially recent research studies that are robust to help you understand what the research field says about certain issues, including abortion. So I wanted to start today by introducing our panels, and then we'll ask a couple of questions from them, and then we'll turn over to your questions, some of the questions you have submitted through your registration or the questions you're going to be posting in the chat today. So we have with us today Sarah McCammon, and who's the national political correspondent for NPR and a co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. I think she said she just finished recording one. So make sure you listen to the podcast, subscribe to it. And we have Dr. Katie Woodruff, who's a public health social scientist studying U.S. reproductive and maternal health policy at the Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health Research Group at the University of California in San Francisco. Thank you guys again for being here. So I wanted to start with you, Dr. Woodruff. I think in 2019, you did a course, that was before the overturn of Roe, you published a study about how US newspapers cover abortion. Can you tell us a little bit about how that study came about and what did you find?
Sure. Thank you. It's really great to be here and talking to a group of science writers and others. Uh, I did this study and I continue to look at how news covers abortion because, of course, we all know how powerful the news media are in influencing public opinion and public policy. What the news focuses on really shapes policymakers' agendas. And that includes, what facts are included or omitted, what voices are included, who gets to speak in news coverage and who is not included. And all of this shapes the way the public understands these issues, not just what we know about it, but also who we believe is responsible for taking action to do something about it. So when we think about regulation of abortion and government's role in regulating it or in supporting access to it, it's really important to know how news covers it. So my previous study, which I believe there's a link that can be shared, looked at news coverage from 2013 to 2016 in the leading newspapers in the country. And I just want to briefly describe that, and then I can talk a little bit about what we found since then. At that time, most of the time when abortion was being covered, it was really covered as a sort of a political hot button issue. So again, the idea that today we're here talking about hot button issues, this is very much reflected in coverage, looking at it in literally a political context, not even a policy context, but a political context. Who's up, who's down, who's winning, using abortion as an issue. But actually, most of the time when abortion was in the news, it was only mentioned. It wasn't even really dealt with substantively. So it was very symbolic, like abortion and guns. These are the things that Americans fight about. That sort of symbolic horse race kind of coverage. Very rare to see any actual abortion stories of people who were trying to find or getting an abortion in any kind of coverage. And this is not just, we searched again, not just for like where someone would be quoted or named or anything, but even like a physician sharing a story about what their patient was going through. So even those kinds of secondhand stories were not included in the news very often. At the time, there was a lot of focus on fetal pain and fetal personhood, and we found references to the fetus as a person showing up in about a quarter of the coverage that we looked at, whereas a person like an abortion seeker's actual story in only about 4 to 5% of coverage. So much more personification of the fetus than even personification of the people seeking abortion. And then we know, I am in an academic institution, I represent evidence. I really care about the evidence on abortion, and there's a very large body of good, solid research on abortion and abortion safety. We know abortion is very common. 1 in 4 people will have one in this, 1 in 4 people with the capacity for pregnancy will have one in their lifetime. We know that it's incredibly safe. So much safer than carrying a pregnancy to term, much safer than having your wisdom teeth out. So these basic facts, that it's common, that it's safe, I think there's those facts were almost never included in the news coverage back at that time. And then just one more thing I would mention is that very few stories included there were images, and we didn't really do a detailed image search, sorry, but there were so many images of like a fully rounded pregnant belly with a headless person. Of course, we're all annoyed sort of comically by headless pregnant pictures, but there was a lot of focus on pregnancy later in abortion. I think we're seeing that coming back now too. And the fact that most, that only 1 to 2% of abortions happen after 20 weeks in pregnancy was also just completely absent from the news coverage at that time.
And I believe you've done more research since then. So I'm curious to see what you've learned about more recent years and what are the implications of your findings.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really happy because I just submitted a manuscript for publication today. So it's making its way through the peer-reviewed process. We have 2 different manuscripts out right now being reviewed. But the most recent study, I looked at coverage in the 6 months before the Dobbs decision, which was June 2022, and the year afterwards. So being able to look at after Roe is overturned, how is news coverage changing and what's happening then? And again, from the 5 leading newspapers in the country, so we cannot assume that this is going to represent all news coverage, but it is very indicative. And of course, when you're looking at, this would be the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, AP, and USA Today. These are papers that are read in newsrooms all across the country, and the way they cover any topic, but in particular abortion, is reasonably assumed to be influential in other news sources as well. So in that study, we found much more coverage, much more substantive coverage of abortion, and seeing abortion covered more now as a policy issue. So it is being taken seriously, covered as a serious policy issue, of course. After the overturn of Roe v. Wade, especially, there was a huge spike in coverage at that point. We saw a large number of new reporters coming in, so people who had not reported on abortion before in those sources, reporting for the first time. And sometimes, you know, a sports story that includes something about abortion, or a business story that includes something abortion. So much more, so abortion finding its way into a much wider swath of coverage than before. Most of the time, we're still seeing very limited coverage of the basic facts on abortion. So we searched really in depth for, is abortion common? Only about 7% of stories included that. Is abortion safe? Any mention of safety on abortion? About 6% of stories covered that. A whole set of coverage that I think is being missed, a big story, is about medication abortion. Now, this increased at the end of our time because of the Supreme Court case that deals with mifepristone. But currently, 2/3 of abortions in this country are being done by medication abortion. It is rapidly booming as people's number one choice, both because for people who live in states where abortion is banned, it's much easier to, they can get that. They can't go get a clinical abortion anymore, an in-clinic abortion. And many people prefer it because they can do it at home and it has more privacy. And so, but medication abortion was even mentioned in only 10% of stories. And so there's a lot that can be done to talk about that as an important development in the world of abortion. In terms of who's talking, we saw quotes from politicians and lawyers, again, much more than healthcare providers or researchers. People with abortion are showing up more. So 1 in 5 stories in this sample included someone's personal experience of seeking an abortion. They mostly focused on really rare cases, like, you know, a child rape victim or people who were having complications and very wanted pregnancies, not the sort of traditional abortion story, but it is showing up more. And I guess the other piece that I would want to convey is that the basic facts about abortion are still showing up fairly rarely, but this time we also coded for basic facts about pregnancy. And because I've just been seeing, like, our political discourse is woefully undereducated about pregnancy, and the fact that pregnancy itself is potentially physically harmful, and that those harms and risks of pregnancy physically are higher for people of color. I think that's really important for folks to understand because of institutional racism and the way that they get dealt with in medical settings. People are much more likely to die or have major complications from pregnancy if they're women of color. And all of that is really absent from coverage. And so I think that's an important piece of understanding why abortion is a necessary, you know, very vital form of reproductive health care, so that people can have the option, if they choose to protect their health in that way. I think I'll leave it there in terms of findings, but happy to talk about that more.
Yeah, I mean, the main follow-up question I had, and it's very interesting, like journalists sometimes like don't read about research on journalism. So it's very interesting to find out what researchers are looking at as far as how we do what we do. But I'm curious, if you were to sum up some of the main advice or take-home messages based on the research you have done as far as how journalists can better cover abortion, what would it be?
Great question. Thank you. I think I have sort of 2 buckets, I would say. In a very specific way, I'd be really careful of language. I think, I mean, we're in 2024. No mainstream news outlet should be uncritically using terms like heartbeat ban or unborn baby. I mean, if you're attributing them to someone who's speaking, that's one thing, but we found use of these in every one of our sources, not in a quote from a from, not a quoted source, or referring to the pregnant person as the mother. I think those all play into anti-abortion rhetoric in ways that are really important for folks to be aware of and to try to avoid if they're trying to be even-handed. And then the other thing is to be aware of both sidesism. Again, I've just briefly alluded to, but we have a very strong body of evidence, just really gold standard research showing that abortion does not cause harms. In fact, it's being denied an abortion when somebody wants one that has lasting harms in terms of their economic status, their physical well-being, and sort of their children's well-being as well. So these findings are really, they're as close to unequivocal as it gets in social science. And so to feel like you have to, from an evidence base, you have to give equal weight to both sides, that is ludicrous. I understand that these are political and moral conversations as well, and there may be news reasons to give some conversation to both sides, but certainly from an evidence base, there is no point in pregnancy when it is safer to deny someone an abortion than to allow them to have one. And there's no reason to put limits on abortion in the way that we're seeing so many states do at this point.
Thank you. And Sarah, I wanted to turn to you and kind of follow up on the same topic, which is, staying kind of unbiased, but also avoiding both sidesism, which is a kind of a delicate balance. And there have been some questions, including some in the chat now, about how do you stay unbiased, or how do you keep your personal feelings and emotions about the topic out of your reporting? What's your experience been?
Well, I think obviously everybody has a personal story. They have a perspective that they were raised with. They have life experience, and everybody's life experiences are different. But I think if you go into journalism, and I'm not talking about advocacy journalism because that is a separate bucket in my mind, but we're talking about mainstream journalism. You have to go into it with the idea that your own views, opinions, feelings, perspectives are just not that important. What's important is trying to tell good stories, trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand the relevant perspectives that are in play and that are informing public policy debates, trying to understand the facts, as Dr. Woodruff was just talking about, understand the science as much as possible. Or, we as journalists, most of us are not scientists or doctors ourselves. Some are. I am not. Most of us are not. So, having knowledge and discernment about what's a good source and what's not, and where to go for good information. Those are all things that journalists are trained in. And so for me, obviously there are stories that I cover that are very emotional, and I have feelings about them. I have thoughts about them, but as much as possible, I try to remember what my job is and what it is not. My job is not to persuade anybody to think anything, but it is just to inform, to shed light, to effectively convey where the debate stands and what the important information is around that debate. And sometimes that's through telling personal stories, like Dr. Woodruff was talking about. I think those are so important for people to really understand the real impact of policies and medical decisions on real people. Of course, not every story is going to have a patient voice in it. That's just not possible. And I don't think we demand that of other policy issues, that every single policy issue include and I know that Dr. Woodruff wasn't saying that was the case, but I think it's understood that, when we're talking about any issue of public policy debate, it's in the sum total of the coverage. It's important to include a lot of perspectives and experiences, but certainly every story about a bill in Congress or a debate in presidential debate is not going to have the time or bandwidth to go into every detail of each issue. But I think it's about looking for a good balance of, are we covering these ideas thoroughly in our coverage as a whole? And I think one of the biggest things that helps mitigate against personal bias is just curiosity. If I walk into a room with the assumption that I know everything, well, that's what a fundamentalist does. They assume that they have all the answers and they know everything and their perspective is correct. And the journalists should be the opposite of fundamentalists. We should be curious. We should be open-minded. We should be willing to learn. We should be looking for the things we don't already know and understand and trying to understand them better so that we can explain them to our audience and help our readers and listeners understand them as well. So even being curious about perspectives you might disagree with, I think helps inform, why when it comes to hot button sensitive issues, why are they so sensitive? Why are they so controversial? Why are they so divisive? If you enter those kinds of conversations with the assumption that your perspective is the only perspective, you're not going to be a very good reporter, because you're not going to inform people about anything that they don't already know, quite frankly.
Mhm.
You can preach to the choir, or you can inform and try to understand and try to foster a more thorough, meaningful conversation than the one that we're already having. And so that's kind of how I approach journalism.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I was going to pick on what you mentioned about sources. And we got this question from several of the registrants too, is finding sources is difficult sometimes. And like sometimes maybe even the clinics don't give you access to their physicians or the patients they might have. Also the question of, what if people want to be anonymous because of the climate today? How do you handle, finding sources? And the other thing you mentioned, finding reliable sources. How do you go about that? What's your process?
Well, when I'm reporting on abortion specifically, I often go through clinics and providers, because those are medical professionals who are in touch with patients and are in a position to connect me with patients who are willing to talk to a reporter. Obviously, there are medical privacy rules like HIPAA. We all know about that. But as I think probably we all know, patients have the right to say, I give up my HIPAA rights. I'm going to talk to a reporter because this is something that's important. And so that has happened quite a few times. I believe when some of the COVID restrictions were prompting some states, especially southern states, to shut down abortion providers over ostensibly lack of PPE. I talked to doctors in several states, and I think to a couple of patients as well, about their experiences, having to travel from place to place while the clinics were shut down. That's just one example, but I've also had people come to me, and I think it's similar to the way that you sort of vet anybody. You look them up in public databases, you try to corroborate what they've said. When you've got a patient coming through a doctor, that's pretty easy corroboration of the fact that they did indeed have that procedure. And then there's obviously a conversation with the source about how they're going to be portrayed, what they're willing to say on the record. You have to, especially with patients and people who are not, politicians or experienced interviewees, ethically, we're obligated to just be very clear about when we're on the record and when we're not, and what that means. And certainly there are times that we've granted, full or partial anonymity to patients. It's not something that we do a whole lot in general in our reporting, but with this issue, particularly when you're talking about patients who could face, legal risks, or maybe afraid for their safety or even their employment, things like that, or things that we hear from time to time around the abortion issue. We have a little more latitude to provide some degree of anonymity, but we have, very robust standards and rules around that, around when we do it, how we do it, who has to know, who has to sign off. Which of course are explained to the patients before they consent to be interviewed.
I have a question about terminology. How do you guys have sort of a style guide about what to use, as far as, we have so many nuanced terminologies like around anti-abortion, pro-life, etc. So how do you choose those? What do you refer to? How do you guys go about?
Sure. At NPR, at least, just speaking for my employer only, our terminology has evolved over time, and we have sort of a public style guide that we can refer people to if they have questions about the words we use, which they do very often. And those are updated sometimes, based on feedback, based on changing needs of the time. I don't make any of those decisions. Those are decisions that are made by essentially the ethics editor. We pretty closely follow AP style, Associated Press, but not 100%. There are some things that we do differently. I think there was a time before I was here, when NPR used pro-life and pro-choice. And again, this is like I didn't make these rules, and I can't speak fully to why, but I think the thinking at the time was that those were the terms that the advocates used, and so we were going to call them what they wanted to be called. But I think over time the thinking evolved into the idea that we should just be more specific, because those terms can be contested what they mean. And so now we talk about abortion rights supporters or abortion rights opponents, and sometimes abortion opponents, abortion rights supporters. I think the rationale for that is that talking about abortion, really, when you're talking about public policy, you're not necessarily talking about what someone thinks or feels about abortion morally or ethically, although that is a factor. Really, we're talking about what public policy someone favors. I mean, it's entirely possible for people to have a moral objection or discomfort with abortion or some abortions and still favor legal abortion, for example. So we're being specific about, we're talking about abortion rights versus just abortion, the idea of it. And in general, I think we talk about using specific language, very specific, precise language whenever possible, because that, I think, helps reduce some of the uncertainty and the room for error and the room for, hyperbole or misinformation.
Thank you.
Nessie, sorry
Yes.
to jump in. I had two other quick thoughts about sources
Please.
that I thought might be helpful. One is abortion funds in every region help to match abortion seekers with the funds, the money, like literally give them money to help support, to afford their abortions. They can be a good source of also talking to people. I would not try to call, like, the abortion hotline. The fund hotline is not a way to try to get a connection. But if people are reporting on this issue continuously, you should get to know the executive director of your local abortion fund and find out what you can learn from them. National Network of Abortion Funds would be the best place to search for what's local. And then there's an organization called We Testify, which within the abortion repro rights movement, there's sort of a feeling of needing ethical responsibility to support people who want to tell their abortion stories and help them understand the implications, what they might be at risk for in terms of targeting, but also help them feel supported in that. And We Testify is a fantastic organization that does that work. I know some journalists might feel like, oh, those are people who are like prepared to tell their stories, but there's still some really raw, great stories to be heard from those folks, and that could be a place to look as well.
If I could just respond to that quickly. The abortion funds, I think if you know your local abortion fund leader, that may be the case, but there was a point in the last couple of years when a lot of the abortion funds were actually asking reporters not to call them and ask for leads, because I think they were getting inundated. They were so busy, and also they're very protective in the post-obs era of patient privacy. So not to say that don't do that, but just be aware that there has been some sensitivity around that, and it may vary from fund to fund what they're willing or able to do. If I were a local reporter, I think I would be more comfortable. I think having a relationship with that local fund, like Dr. Woodruff said, is a great idea. But just, I would say, be sensitive to the fact that they get a lot of requests, and they may not be able or comfortable sharing at this point in history, especially in some of the red states. And then the issue I've had with We Testify is that many of their, I'm not sure if it's all, but many of the people that they train receive a stipend for their time, which I fully sympathize with the idea that it is labor, it's time. And I have no ethical issue with them doing that, but I think it's something that journalistic organizations have to be aware of and talk about, whether or not they're comfortable with, under their policy, with using sources who have been paid. I think we have used them in the past. We've moved away from doing so for that reason. If we ever were to do it again, I would want to disclose. I would feel like I needed to disclose that, simply because it's a little bit non-standard. Certainly we would never pay for an interview. If a nonprofit is paying somebody for an interview, again, it's a bit unusual, and I understand the reason for it, but I'm not weighing in on whether it's good or bad, but it's just something to be aware of, because it may conflict with some news organizations' ethical standards.
Thank you. So, I want to turn to audience questions, but I wanted to ask you guys, What piece of advice do you have for journalists when it comes to covering abortion, if you were going to send, leave them with a tip or something you have seen that they do wrong and you would like to correct it, what would it be? Maybe Dr. Woodruff, if you want to start.
I guess I could just say one other thing, which is a little bit challenging the framework for this whole conversation, which is a lot of our coverage and a lot of the way we approach this issue in public discourse assumes and reinforces the idea that this is a very controversial, divisive issue for the American public. And I just want to challenge that a little bit, that actually 3 out of 4 Americans really believe that this decision should be left to the person who's pregnant in consultation with their doctor, and that consistently across the years, majorities of Americans think that abortion should be legal in all or most circumstances. And that even breaks down by subgroups. I mean, in the latest polling, even among Republicans, before the Dobbs decision, way more Republicans supported, not way more, sorry, let me be precise, but more Republicans supported Roe v. Wade than wanted it to be overturned. And that's still true. So there's really broad public support for the right to access abortion in this country, and yet we're not seeing news coverage that reflects that. And so I think in a way that just perpetuates this misperception that this is really a highly polarized issue, when in fact it's not.
What are your thoughts, Sarah? What advice do you have?
The question, can you just rephrase the question one more time?
Yeah, what advice do you have for journalists? Do you have any tips, or if you see, some of the coverage that you wish were different or had been done better?
Okay. I mean, I think that's a really big picture question, so I'm just kind of trying to think about which piece of it to answer. I mean, I think it depends on the story, right? So I think, I mean, sometimes if you see a particular story that you think is missing some context, that's an opportunity, right, to go do a follow-up and take a closer look. I've definitely done that. In fact, I think some of the coverage around the Republican platform has been, I don't want to say inaccurate, but some of the framing I've disagreed with, that the idea that the revised, the 2024 platform that is expected to be ratified next week at the convention, the language was just agreed on this week. It's an update from really 2016 because nothing happened in 2020 because of the pandemic with the platform. Some of the coverage has framed it as a moderation of the 2016 language. And, there's an argument to be made that it is, but, I've been talking with some experts who think really, depending on how you interpret some of the language, it may not be. It's also quite ambiguous. And so, sometimes, I mean, that's just one very, very recent example of a place where I saw some coverage that I thought, I think something's missing there, so I'll go do my own story.
Let's see. There's a question, Sarah, maybe you have had to deal with it. How do you prepare for a potential fallout after a story goes up? How do you protect yourself and your sources from harassment? How do you guys deal with that?
It's something I've always worried about, but I've been surprised how little harassment there's been. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes get angry messages on social media, but that's kind of par for the course. And so far, I'm happy to say that I don't think none of the sources that I've talked to that I'm aware of have had serious issues. That said, a lot of them have been first name only or limited identification, so that helps too. I think the fact that NPR has allowed us to protect identities of people has certainly helped. But when it comes to fallout and pushback, I mean, I think this is an issue that you really shouldn't cover if you're afraid of a little bit of pushback. It is, I mean, to Dr. Woodruff's point, there is broad support for legal access to abortion. But there's also some nuance to that. I mean, the polling, I think, is pretty clear that most people are very supportive of access in the first trimester. There's actually majority opposition to access in the third trimester. Now, very few abortions happen in the third trimester, and most are for medical reasons. But if you ask people in theory, that they're there's a lot of opposition to that. And in the middle, there's actually pretty divided opinions. And so I think it is still an issue that people struggle with to one degree or another. And those who are very opposed are strongly, strongly opposed. And so there's a lot of emotion around it. It's a very personal issue. It's an issue that affects, obviously people's health and entire trajectory of their lives sometimes. And so, while the divisiveness of it may be exaggerated to some degree, it does remain an emotional and divisive issue. The abortion issue, I would argue, is the reason that Trump was elected in 2016. The awareness on the part of his base that the Supreme Court was at stake, and the Supreme Court was, poised to make some critical decisions about abortion. So I also don't want to undersell the importance of it. And I think that anybody who's covering it just has to be mindful of that. And that, again, is why, for me, I try to really avoid unforced errors. I try to be as accurate and specific and technical and sort of, I don't want to say unemotional, because these are emotional issues, but I try to keep myself out of it as much as possible and simply describe what's happening and allow people to describe what's happened to them. And I think that won't insulate you from everything, but it leaves less room for being attacked. I mean, even just trying to choose the most neutral language, the most medically specific language possible. I think that helps diffuse the issue a little bit. It may also be that our media landscape is so divided that people aren't even listening to stuff they disagree with, or reading or watching things they disagree with anymore. So that may be also a part of the reason that I don't hear from as many people as I might have expected.
Yeah, I think that was one of the questions that had come up too. It's how much do you focus on the medical side of abortion versus the politics of it, right? How do you balance that? And I don't know if either of you guys have any advice about that, how much of it should be included in our stories? Because it is a political issue, even though it's a health issue.
I'll just
when
say
we're covering it, it's often because it's of the politics, right? Because somebody wants to restrict it. So
yeah, and I'm really happy when I see abortion covered as a substantive policy issue. I am not one who thinks abortion should only ever be treated as healthcare and a personal decision and nothing else, because the politics and the policies around it are so important for whether people have the ability to exercise that option or not. So, and I think the more we treat it as a serious policy issue, the more we will, if we truly, drill down on what it means to have it available or not, and then people really can understand the implications of that. And again, some of the contrast, I think, in one of the questions in chat about the contrast between politicians or states that restrict abortion are also the ones that provide the least support for maternal health and for family support. And sometimes just pointing out that juxtaposition can help people understand a little better about what the options are, and how families really have what support they do or don't get in forming their families and making their way through the world in these different states.
So there's a question here, and I'm going to read it. It's a little long, but Sarah, maybe you want to tackle it. It says, it seems some anti-abortion activists or politicians are not genuinely anti-abortion, but are maintaining the position publicly for political gain. The motivation behind the laws is not genuine concern for women and children. Is there any way for journalists to appropriately address those stories, address that in stories, like thinking in terms of how sources are quoted, context to include, etc.?
it's difficult to report on someone's motives unless they've telegraphed them. And if they telegraph them, then of course you should report on that. If they are, caught off on an open mic saying something that reveals their true intentions, or if there's a leaked email, then that becomes news. But and I think some of it comes down to how the questions, asking rigorous questions when we have the opportunity to interview policymakers, trying to sort of get at their motivation and their philosophy whenever possible. But at the same time, as a journalist, I try not to ascribe motives to people because I think that starts to get outside the purview of what I'm able to do, what I'm able to defend. But yeah, sometimes people tip their hand, and sometimes people reveal, contradictions between what they say and what they've they do or what they believe. And when those moments happen, I think they're certainly newsworthy.
Thank you. Dr. Woodruff, this question is for you, and I don't know if it falls within your purview, but I wanted to read it to you. It says, how are young doctors in off-limit states being trained in abortion? I've heard that UCSF is offering fellowships, and in California, doctors help patients in other states.
Oh yeah, that's a great question, actually. I think for folks who are looking for untold stories, the impact of abortion bans on medical education and nursing education across the country is a really interesting one, because in fact trainees in states where abortions are banned no longer have the opportunity to practice those skills, which are again very common, very important skills for all obstetrician gynecologists to have, and other kinds of healthcare providers as well. I don't know. I know that UCSF has a fantastic training program, and they are in partnership with medical schools in other parts of the country, trying to bring trainees into California to give them opportunities to practice. I don't know the latest on how that is going. There was some but a lot of effort to try to give folks a chance to practice if they were in a state where abortion is now banned. And in terms of the question, I'm sorry, was the question about can providers in California provide care to people seeking abortion in other states? Was that the question? So California is now one of several states that has a shield law that is intended to protect providers in California providing any kind of healthcare that would be legal in California, providing it via telemedicine to patients in other states. So the providers are protected by that law. Whether the patients in another state are also protected is an open question, and some states are trying to prosecute or looking into penalties for if you live in a state where abortion is illegal and you get medication abortion from a state where it's not. Is there any penalty for that? So some state law is different for the patients, and that is an important question to be looking into too. There is an increasing amount of scrutiny and potential criminalization of people for seeking abortion care out of these states.
Thank you. Let's see. This is an interesting question, although I think we are living in the middle of a pivotal time in history. But it says, how do you use historical context when interpreting abortion-related events that are happening so quickly?
That's when I interview historians or lawyers who are, there's some law professors who do a really good job of looking at the legal history of the issue and providing context. Yeah. I mean, this is, as a journalist, we rely so much on, we know a little bit about a lot of things and a little bit more about a few things, but we rely so much on physicians, on historians, on attorneys, people who really have the deep expertise in these issues. And then we sort of try to take that and synthesize it in a way that is helpful.
So Dr. Woodruff, somebody's asking about maybe a little more information about your study that you found that some of the basic facts about pregnancy and abortion are not in many news stories. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? And then maybe I turn it to you, Sarah, to see if you have any insight as to why.
This is something I wonder about too, because I'm not a journalist, but I know that there's a distinction between what's news and what's information. This is important information that I wish everybody had, but I know it's not necessarily a journalist's job to provide the basics all the time. That said, I do see in a lot of stories on different topics, there seems to be, if people are still learning about something, or there's something that's sort of that's getting covered frequently, a given paper may have 2 sentences that are sort of boilerplate that are always in a newspaper article about climate change, for instance. Like, most scientists now agree that climate change is caused by human activity, and this is the target goal of making a change, or something like that. So especially in a context where people are making claims about abortion being harmful or about abortion, that there's no reason why people need to get abortions, I think it's important to include those facts. But it would also, I think, be great just to have, you know, it's common, it's safe. Medication abortion is now the majority method in the United States, and it's been used safely in the US by 6 million people since 2020. I mean, sorry, since 2000. If anybody wants citations for any of the stuff that I'm spouting, by the way, I'm happy to be contacted by email to follow up with more detail.
I actually have kind of a follow-up question to that, if that's okay. I was also interested in Sarah's observation earlier about like many journalists who cover abortion sort of being prepared to cover this as a hot button issue. And I think it's interesting to contrast that to the experience many science and health journalists who are on other topics have had. Specifically with the pandemic, I have had this experience where you're covering something and then it kind of becomes more controversial over time. Like I cover COVID-19 and long COVID a lot, and that's definitely been my experience. And I'm wondering how you both panelists think about sort of staying in touch with what the basic facts actually are and kind of keeping those in your stories and keeping that kind of open mind as this polarization sort of continues to happen. I think this is happening with other topics too.
I mean, I think a lot of it, I mean, it's difficult when people, first of all, I'm not a doctor, right? I'm not a scientist. So to some extent, I have to rely on people who are. And that means, you know, trying to have a grasp on what the consensus is. You know, I tend to rely on, you know, large medical organizations and scientific groups that rely on peer review because, you know, there's safety in numbers and you know, I put a lot more weight in information that's coming from those kinds of sources from, you know, universities that again have expertise, medical schools, people who have more training than the average person, to put it really simply. But I think what we're up against is that often I think there's less trust among at least certain segments of the public in institutional authority and in expertise, and so. While we should cite those sources. We should always say, especially when there's, you know, an issue that's, there's a lot of misinformation and public confusion around, we should try to say where we're getting that information from. You know, here's the group that's saying this, here's the physician that's saying this, here's the public body that has reached this conclusion. But even that sometimes won't be enough for some people. So that's a challenge, but we can at least know where we're getting our information, and should.
Dr. Woodruff, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so.
Okay. So Sarah, I wanted to ask you about this, and I don't know if you have encountered it when you're talking to women about this. Do you find that you have to use different skills and tools for sort of a trauma-informed interview, especially if they have been through a traumatic situation or something that they find traumatic to them? Or how do you handle the interviews with, I don't want to call them patients, but you know, some of these individuals? Yeah.
Sure. A lot of it goes back to that idea of sort of ethical consent to an interview. I try to, first of all, make sure that the person understands like who I am and where and how the information will be used, make sure that they feel comfortable with that. And I almost always start out interviews by saying, you know, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and some of them will just be for my own understanding, but, you know, we are on the record. So this, you know, some of this will be used on the radio or in a digital piece online. But I always say, you know, if there's something that you don't feel comfortable answering or you don't want to go into, like, please say so. I will not be offended. You know, it's not talking to a politician who is a public official and has an obligation to respond to public questions. I mean, no one is obligated to tell their story about something that happened involving their health and their body. And if they do, that's something they've decided to do because they hope and believe it will be helpful to other people in some way. so I always sort of approach it with that frame of mind, just, I think about, again, consent, transparency about how the interview will be used, and make sure that they understand at the get-go that they're not going to offend me or break some kind of rule, because when you're an interviewer, you are kind of in a position of power. Even if the person's consented to it, they may not want to disappoint you. They may, want to give you what you need. And so I try to just sort of give them permission to say, I don't really want to go into that. But most of the time, people who've agreed to be interviewed about their abortions or their pregnancy complications have thought about it and have a story they want to tell. So that helps. I think the bigger challenge is sometimes getting to that yes, like finding the right person for the right story. And, I have done stories that didn't have a patient voice in them that I wish did, but, it has to be somebody who's ready and willing. So in those cases, I tend to rely on doctors because they are sort of like the next best thing. They're also in the room. They know a lot about it. They have obviously the medical expertise, and they can tell you what's going on the ground.
Thank you. And this is a tricky one, but maybe you have some insight into it, Sarah. Says, can you talk about what higher education institutions are doing to sorry, it was another one I wanted to read. Sorry, let me go back here. Any advice for student journalists reporting about abortion on a Catholic college campus where there's a lot of pushback from administrators and students about abortion coverage? Or I guess in general, where you're in an area where there's a lot of pushback toward that coverage, how do you handle that?
I think it goes back to being specific and clear and accurate. You have to be careful about what studies you cite and how you quote people. There's a tendency sometimes to say that abortion is dangerous, exaggerate. I mean, of course, any medical procedure has risks, but as Dr. Woodruff said, there's a very good safety record for abortion. And so if you're talking about something like that, or you're talking to someone who you may sincerely believe that it's dangerous because it aligns with their personal religious or moral beliefs, and so they're susceptible to believing. We're all susceptible to believing things that reinforce our narrative. Every single one of us is. And so I think if you're in a situation like that where you're interviewing somebody who is repeating something that's inaccurate, I try to be very thoughtful about what quotes I use or don't use. But I do, I really try sometimes I have sources who are, will say, well, abortion's so bad for women or whatever. And I try to steer them toward talk to me about your moral view about it. Talk to me about your ethical concerns, because that's something, that is something that is, it's a moral or ethical question, and we can talk about that. What I don't want to do is say that, a procedure carries a risk it doesn't carry because, or a level of risk it doesn't carry. So I try to, especially if you're in a community where there is a lot of debate about this issue. I mean, I think it's important to cover that debate, but it's how you cover it and what you say. And it's really important not to spread bad information in so doing.
That's really good advice. Thank you. And this, I think both of you may be able to answer this. Can you talk about what higher education institutions are doing to provide abortion care for students and staff? What are some of the student story angles that are missing from news coverage of colleges and universities, and maybe even high schools?
Again, as a Californian, I know that in California, there's been a big effort to get the California state universities and UCs for students and I believe and staff. And that is somewhat undercovered, including some follow-up challenges in that implementation. Like once we get a lot past what happens when we actually try to implement it, and can students get the care that they want, or does it require them, if they're on their parents' insurances, then they might not have the student insurance. That might mean they still don't qualify to get it on campus, even if it is available on campus. So there's a lot of those like nitty-gritty follow-ups. Oh, I appear to be having unstable internet. Sorry. Anyway, it is a question. I think there are very few campuses that are making sure abortion care is available right on campus, and that would be something to explore in anyone's local area.
Katie, is this something you're looking at or you have written about or reported on? I mean, Sarah, sorry.
Thank you.
Not in a lot of detail. It's a good question. I haven't been that specific about college campuses too much, but I know that sometimes there are contentious plays because obviously there are a lot of young women there, and groups like Students for Life, which is one of the kind of most vocal anti-abortion groups, has spent a lot of time and energy focusing on college campuses specifically, and trying to, persuade college campuses or lobby for college campuses not to carry abortion pills, for example. But it's not something that I've done a lot of specific reporting on.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. We are almost at time. Is there anything else you would like to add? As journalists, we always have to ask that from our sources. So is there anything else our attendees should know?
This is such a cop-out, but I think that's a great last question. I don't have anything more to add other than I always ask that question at the end of interviews, and either people say something totally boring or totally awesome. So I'll let you decide which one this is.
I'm going to go with a totally boring one and just say I am serious. If anyone has questions to follow up on anything I said, katie.woodruff@ucsf.edu. Happy to be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you again for our great panelists. We appreciate you answering all the questions from our attendees and my questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Betsy.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Just a reminder that we'll send out a recording of this session and also a tip sheet after this. So you can sign up to either CASW connectors or the Journalist Resource newsletters to get those, and we'll also send it to everybody who attended. Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.